Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jeff Angermann. Jeff Angermann, PhD, is a scientific director at 374 Labs, LLC. He earned his doctorate in agriculture and environmental chemistry with a research emphasis in environmental toxicology from the University of California, Davis, and completed a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship in vascular physiology and pharmacology at the University of Nevada School of Medicine. In addition to analytical process optimization, Dr. Angermann is particularly interested in pulmonary and vascular biomarker validation, as well as the assessment of the pulmonary and vascular toxicity of metals and organic contaminants. Jeff, now I'm going to turn things over to you.
Everybody, and thank you for tuning into this virtual conference on the chemistry of cannabis. I want to begin by thanking Veronica Allen and Aaron Biros of Cannabis Industry Journal for conceiving and organizing the symposium, and for inviting us here at 374 Labs in Nevada to present. This will be a lot of fun. I'd also like to thank my fellow presenters, Terry Potter, Michelle Bradak, Hannah O'Brien, and Amanda Rigdon. Collectively, we have some really diverse perspectives on the topic of establishing and running a cannabis lab. I think and hope that you will all develop an enhanced perspective of some of the major issues facing cannabis labs today, regardless of the physical state and preparatory state you happen to be in. I'm going to give you an overview of some of the main challenges that cannabis labs face in all phases of operation, from initial planning and application, to setup, to daily operations, to long-term operating considerations. Our view is specific to the state of Nevada, which legalized recreational cannabis use on July 1 of this year. And even though each state in which you may choose to operate has a unique set of structural constraints that dictate your trajectory in the planning and operations phases, most of what we're going to discuss today is generalizable to all U.S. states operating in the cannabis industry. So a little about us to start. 374 Labs is an LLC incorporated in Nevada in July 2014 with 4 owners and 2 full-time employees. We were the first lab to test commercial product in the state of Nevada and are also the first and only lab to achieve ISO IEC 17025-2005 accreditation in the state. So today we're going to talk about a variety of topics, including advice and considerations on building your operations team, what to keep in mind when navigating local and state regulations, the importance of understanding your market characteristics and client base, with an eye to distinctions between medical and recreational markets, how to achieve optimal timing in emerging markets, the array of scientific challenges you'll face as you build and operate a lab, some perspectives on method development for analyzing the diverse array of products you'll be receiving from your clients, thoughts on the big picture issue of industry standardization and why it's so critical to your long-term success, and we'll wrap up with a short list of overarching challenges that are a distillation of the many issues we will discuss over the next 40 or so minutes. I think most of us know that raising capital, even under so-called legitimate circumstances, is a challenge, but it's even tougher in the cannabis space. You don't have the traditional options other businesses can avail themselves of, like government-backed loans. So, do you bring in a capital investor who may want to dictate your approach, or build your team first and search for capital later? Either way, you will need funding because analytical equipment is not cheap, and neither are the best employees. I want to encourage you at the outset to balance business and science when forming your team, because you will need both to be successful. If your team is already assembled, take time to evaluate your human capital strengths and weaknesses. As a result of this evaluation, should you choose to hire business people or do you hire scientists? Or can you go back and build a team with both and reduce costs? This is going to sound a little harsh, but the term avoid dead weight is an important thing to keep in mind. Here in Nevada, we had several groups that struggled early on because of the competitive application process and requirements. Many of these applicants added doctors and lawyers and other individuals to bolster their application, but these folks had a lot of opinions and didn't add much value to the operations. While they may add value to the application, they can make daily operation and corporate culture difficult. There's a saying that there are too many chiefs in some situations, and this definitely applies here. So a regulatory capped market, which is an appropriate way to describe the cannabis space in many state markets, has both pros and cons. In many states, including Nevada, you have an application window and a limit on the number of state-approved marijuana facilities, including labs. These barriers to entry can be good. They can also limit potential client base. This is not like clinical toxicology or urinalysis labs, where you can get samples from across the country. In many cases, samples cannot cross state lines. So understanding your state requirements is key. Each state is different from a requirement perspective for tests, as well as compliance. One size does not fit all. If you don't know what your state will require, you are setting yourself up for failure. You have to become a lobbyist and a regulation specialist to monitor and track changing regulation even within your own state. If we look to Colorado and the evolution of the regulatory landscape there, we have an interesting and relevant example of this point. Colorado is one of several early adopter states that revised lab testing regulations toward a higher level of stringency following a series of very public and damaging crises. Which brings us to accreditation. External accreditation is necessary, especially in the cannabis space, as it brings legitimacy to the industry. This becomes important when we consider the future of the industry at the federal level, particularly with regard to standardization, which we will discuss shortly. Keep in mind that different states require different accreditations, and some don't require any. Accreditation adds costs and can be difficult to maintain if not implemented correctly. Labs are typically exempted from taxes as we are a service-based industry, but state licensing and application fees can be very expensive, in the thousands to tens of thousands of dollars each year. For instance, in Nevada, we pay annual application fees that are dependent on the type of entity, but for labs, it's $15,000 for a rec license plus $5,000 application fee plus a $3,000 medical license renewal. Regulations can also impact things such as zoning requirements and dictate zoning requirements. So for instance, Sparks, where 374 Labs is located, only allowed citing of medical marijuana and recreational marijuana entities in the industrial sector. This limits available space and real estate and can give landlords leverage to charge more. There's also monthly costs associated with subscription to state tracking systems like Metric. And requirements to upload all sample data to state systems can be very cumbersome, time-consuming, and costly if done manually. Confident Cannabis is building an API hook-in for Metric, but Colorado only had the manual input option for years. This alone could require another full-time position, much like medical coding for physicians. Security requirements like 1080p cameras, 30-day video recording retention, locking fridges and freezers, concrete bollards, roll-down security doors, can all be required by the state for labs. Interesting to note that our lab was required to install motion detectors in the dead space in the ceiling below the permanent roof or ceiling and our drop-down ceiling to eliminate the possibility of people hiding up there. The state will dictate what analytical tests you're required to perform, to what limited detection, and how often. This is your core business, but it will impact the equipment you need. Another thing to consider is the cost implications of pickup versus drop-off, which is often underestimated. This can disrupt lab flow and sample prep. Additionally, think about Friday at 4:30 p.m., also known as Beer 30, being 10 minutes after 4:20, for sample pickup calls, for instance. When we look at different states and the ways they have approached the regulation of commercial cultivation and sales, we see some distinct differences between these 5 western states listed here. In the case of Colorado, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, and California, personal cultivation was all legalized within about a 4-year time span between 1996 and 2000. There was a big fast forward to commercial cultivation legalized for both medical and recreational, with the exception of California, which had an 8-year span between personal cultivation and commercial cultivation legalized for medical purposes. So these states have all had different trajectories in terms of the time arcs of their development, but similar targets, and that is moving toward both recreational and medical legalization. In addition, there's a great deal of divergence among the current requirements for laboratory testing in these 5 states. Note that Nevada has a very significant testing profile requiring 9 tests total for both medical and recreational marijuana. And if we turn to California as an example, even though they're in the middle of finalizing the requirements of Assembly Bill 243, they, as of yet, don't have any current requirements for lab testing. So this turns the situation that we see for California, which is usually that they're the state leader for regulatory requirements for various industries, including environmental, on its head. And they are following a little bit behind some of the other states. So in Nevada, we've had a bit of a unique perspective on a strong regulatory presence from the outset of the industry, which has allowed us to really understand how we're going to develop as a business. With regard to local regulation, it's important to keep in mind that city approval does not mean state licensing. A cautionary tale of the Las Vegas 8 is that they were approved by the city but not approved by the state, resulting in a big lawsuit. And it's also important to keep in mind that local jurisdictions may not be marijuana friendly. Carson City is an example of not allowing any recreational dispensaries within the city limits. Sparks had a 14-day moratorium on recreational even though they allowed medical. This required the city to develop new ordinances to allow for even the testing of recreational marijuana. It's important to get to know your local council members to see how they feel about cannabis. They can make life difficult for you if they're biased against it. Also, considering taxes for local jurisdictions, flat fees versus percent of gross revenue base is one critical distinction. This applies to Reno versus Sparks, and is one of the reasons why we set up in Sparks. This can be less of an issue for labs, but the margins for labs are not always equal for the cultivation and retail side, so it's important to keep in mind. With regard to other requirements, such as loading zones, only Sparks required a loading zone for laboratories. Unfortunately, it ate up a portion of our lab that was originally designated for a different use. The City of Sparks also wants us to notify local police before doing a pickup. This requires a trip plan, a driver, and vehicle details. This is on top of, or in addition to, the trip plan the state requires us to file. So it's very important to keep in mind how local jurisdictions require layered regulations on top of what the state may require. So here on this slide, I have a number of different issues or items that we have to consider when planning or building an analytical laboratory for cannabis. And so we have a number of different things: instrument selection, pickup requirements, different endpoints like pesticides, metals, and microbial, the application requirements, local business licensing, regulations, hiring versus equity stake for employees, security systems, proficiency testing, and accreditation. These are all things we need to deal with. What do all of these things have in common, and why are they all critical? Well, the short answer to that is that they all impact your budget, and they all have to be budgeted. So here's some 2016-2017 state medical marijuana patient comparison data we pulled from the Marijuana Policy Project, or MPP, website. You can see the rate of growth of medical marijuana patients in various states with medical-only programs, and the drop in other states that have legalized recreational. I bring up this data not to point out these trends in and of themselves, but to tie these trends to the demand for specific cannabis laboratory services such as metals and pesticides that generate revenue for labs. At the bottom of this table, you can see that as of August 2017, only 55% of state markets are regulating pesticides, and only 35% are regulating metals. These considerations not only impact cannabis consumer health, but also limit the revenue potential of labs operating in these states. In some states, the market may be very small at first, especially under a medical-only program. As a result, you need to set realistic expectations and projections for volume and plan and budget accordingly. If you think your lab will do $5 million in testing a year and you raise and spend capital accordingly, and the state only does $4 million total, you are in trouble. It's hard to grow your lab if the market cannot grow or is not growing, as will be the case for regulatory capped markets under some circumstances. So with regard to the issue of patient numbers and product purchase limits, we have an example that I'd like to point out. Nevada had 14,500 patients in 2016 with a consumption cap at 2.5 ounces every 14 days. This means that about 59,000 pounds were legally available for sale. This doesn't account for medical reciprocity, which may impact these numbers further if people are obtaining product elsewhere, i.e. out of state. So this becomes important when we think about the state designation for batch and lot size for testing. So for instance, if we have 59,000 pounds legally available for sale over an entire year, divided by a 5-pound lot size, meaning only every 5 pounds gets tested under state law, we have a total of 11,800 annual tests. If that batch size or lot size increases to 10 pounds, then we only have a total of 5,900 annual tests. It's relatively easy to run these projections if you can assess your market size and you can assess your lot size or be aware of your lot size and determine your revenue potential and plan accordingly for budgets. It's also important to note the number of licensed cultivators or producers in your state and make early efforts to get to know them and establish relationships with them. So Nevada has some examples of almost 1 year transpiring from award of licenses to first cultivator harvest. This could make it very challenging to project inception of operations and scaling of operations for laboratories because we rely obviously on those clients. So it's important to have realistic expectations of when your client base will be ready. It's reasonable to expect a 4 to 5 month lead time to harvest after all state and local approvals have been met. And then you have to consider other aspects of your build out. Are you going to do a green build or tenant improvements to your laboratory? This might be a good investment if you plan on being in business at the same location for a long period of time. You also might want to plan for future growth or expansion, especially if your state market is transitioning from medical to recreational. Keep in mind that your own timeline for build-out, method development, and validation can differ markedly from others, even within the same state. Everything takes longer in the cannabis industry. It's just something we have to accept. Some other thoughts on this topic. You don't want to be late to market or so early that you sit around waiting for your product to be ready to be tested. That can result in burning through cash on things like employee salaries and rent. And the red tape and regulations around the cannabis industry can make things take longer. So all of your regular building code inspections and state inspections on top of everything else we've talked about can delay things further, both for your clients and for your own laboratory. So some of the scientific challenges I'd like to talk about in the cannabis space relate to the lack of standardization at a federal level. This is a major long-term issue for the cannabis testing industry. As you can see from this little figure at the right, we don't have any currently accepted international testing standards for cannabis. There have been several groups that have attempted to start efforts to work on this, but as of yet, nothing has congealed around acceptable international or even federal standards. So as a result, there are no published methods on cannabis analytical procedures. And each lab is operating with their own in-house methods that they developed for themselves. On top of that, a lot of labs are hesitant to share their methods with competing laboratories in the same market for fear that they might impact their market share. It's important to keep in mind that cannabis has a number of matrix issues, being a very complex plant, and that you have to account for these when you are standardizing your methods and doing method development. One example of this is the decision to engage in matrix matching versus neat calibration for cannabinoid and pesticide calibration. In many cases, matrix matching is desirable because you get a higher degree of accuracy because you are assessing relative to a known matrix. Sometimes, though, it's an additional cost, an additional step that you cannot afford in a high throughput situation. So this is a very important point to consider, whether or not you'll matrix match your calibrations or do neat calibrations. There are also validation challenges in this industry. Sometimes you'll be the first to market in the cannabis testing space, and there won't be any other labs in operation. And so who do you compare your results to? If product can't be shipped across state lines and you cannot compare with laboratories in other states, you are therefore the sole authority in that state. As a result, you're going to open yourself up to scrutiny. And you might be criticized by some of your early clients for being inaccurate in your cannabinoid titration results. This, again, is a big distinction with an example of a closely allied industry, toxicology or clinical laboratory testing, where you can engage in round-robin testing and send samples around to many labs to check their accuracy. This is something to keep in mind. Other scientific challenges relate to, in some cases, the lack of a gradual ramp-up for methods and equipment. Here in Nevada, we're required to perform 9 different tests, including moisture content, potency analysis, terpene analysis, foreign matter inspection, microbial screening, mycotoxin testing, heavy metal screening, pesticide residue analysis, and residual solvents analysis. In contrast, Steve Hill, when they started out, just did potency. So in Nevada and increasingly in other states, all methods and accreditations are needed on day 1 of operation. This can be a big challenge in that you have to have all of your methods in place and operational and validated on day 1 of business. This means that you have to have really good in-house capabilities from the outset and training of your employees on all of these different assays. As a result, you might have to have multiple people with varied backgrounds from the outset of business. For instance, you might have to have capability, unique capability in microbial analysis, necessitating the hire of a microbiologist, as well as an analytical chemist to perform conventional pesticide, metals, and cannabinoid assessments. The work we do also requires moving across several instruments for one sample, including HPLC, GC, ICP, LCM, SMS, PCR, and traditional plate assays. It's really important to have cross-training of employees so that they are capable of carrying out all of these different assays on their own, okay? This provides redundancy in the event that you have lapses in employees for personal or other reasons. If we look at specifically pesticide requirements as an example, in Nevada we have 23 pesticides we're required to screen for, including some complex high molecular weight macrocycles like abamectin, pictured at top right, and exceptionally nonpolar analytes such as pentachloronitrobenzene or PCNB below it. So this list of pesticides is going to vary on a state-by-state basis, and it has profound implications for your instrumentation, training, and analytical operations. This can be a big challenge in situations where you are required by state regulation to analyze pesticides at a very low detection limit, especially in products that have a high cannabinoid content, because that high cannabinoid content can provide a major interference and impediment to accurate isolation of the analytes you're required to screen for. This can entail multiple sample preps for each sample and necessitate the use of both GC and LC approaches, adding quite a bit of money to your capital outlays for equipment. If we turn to microbial requirements, you can see from the table in this slide, this is the very commonly cited Table 9 of the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia, or the Cannabis Inflorescence, this version from 2013. This is a list of microbial endpoints that has informed a lot of state regulations across the United States, and is currently the basis for the microbial regulations here in the state of Nevada. Because there's not a lot of detail here, there is a lot of reading between the lines that's required when formulating an approach to analyzing these different microbial endpoints. As a result, here in Nevada, up to this point, we've had the ability to choose between plate-based assays and RT-PCR microarray or qPCR-based assays for microbial endpoints. This is currently a topic of great interest and contention in the state of Nevada and is under review by the Department of Taxation and the Department of Agriculture in terms of refinement of these standards. Currently, we're looking at a refinement of these standards to include additional endpoints to the ones listed on this table, such as Aspergillus fumigatus, Aspergillus flavus, Aspergillus cereus, and Aspergillus niger, 4 different species of Aspergillus mold. Which brings us to the yeast and mold question. The yeast and mold issue is one that vexes a lot of state regulatory agencies. And that's because it's probably the single most prominent impediment to wide-scale adoption of RT-PCR microarray or qPCR approaches, given the complexity of yeast and mold taxonomic profiles in cannabis. So these things are all important to be aware of when you're planning your approach for this specific endpoint for your laboratory. Turning to metals, you can see in Nevada these icons from the periodic table representing the 4 different metals that we're required to analyze for: arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and lead. These are pretty standard 4 endpoints, though the limits may vary on a state-by-state basis. It's important to be well aware of the state's required method detection limit for these 4 metals, as well as the regulatory limit on these metals. This is important because it's going to inform your choice of instrument for analyzing metals. You may have the choice depending on required sensitivity, between ICP-MS and OES. You could also go for graphite flame AAS. So these choices can be made based on the basis of required throughput or sample load, as well as on the method detection limits that are required. All of these things are important in making big decisions on capital outlays for instruments. In addition, with regard to metals, we have to be concerned about sample prep requirements, and these are highly matrix dependent. The standard these days is to turn to microwave analytical preparation, which adds an additional expense on top of the analytical instrument. This is pretty much the industry standard across the board. So selecting the right equipment is very important. The state requirements are going to drive equipment purchase decisions. We have a well-defined battery of tests that are required by the state, specified limits of detection, usually in the part per million to part per billion range, and the equipment that you require for potency versus pesticides will definitely impact your budget. In addition to this, if you're one of the first labs operating in your state and the state doesn't have much scientific capability at the regulatory level, you might have to turn around and provide the state with scientific support. Make sure that the equipment you choose can handle your projected sample volume. This is super important and requires that you assess your capacity for growth over the coming years. Another important thing to consider is whether you're going to shoot for new versus refurbished equipment. There are arguments for both, but I want to caution everybody that buying refurbished equipment is a big risk in some cases in terms of the stability of that instrumentation and the ability to use it for long periods of time without it failing on you. It's always best to buy new equipment under a guaranteed service contract, but this does add a lot of cost that has to be factored into your budget. With regard to method development, this is going to tie up a lot of your time and energy once you get operations up and running. It's also going to take time and expertise. You're going to always use different methods and sample preps for different products, which your patients and your clients will bring to you. These include flour, trim, oils, cookies, gummies, lotions, salves, and even suppositories. You got to balance quality analytical results with your business flow, and this can often be a big challenge. Another thing that's important to note with regard to method development is which reference materials you choose and which standards you choose. There are an array of different cannabinoid standards available now on the market relative to even 2 to 3 years ago. And the quality of these standards has a significant impact on your cannabinoid titration results. So choosing the correct standard that's well validated with high purity is absolutely critical. There's a cost-benefit analysis you have to engage in regarding developing methods in-house versus outsourcing them. There are laboratories that will consult in other markets, in non-competing markets, to help you develop your methods. And this can often be a cost-effective way to scale up if you lack the expertise to do it on your own, or you're under time pressure to develop your methods quickly. Of course, there are also franchising opportunities that also exist that are an extension of this. Also, with regard to method development, you have to be adept at developing sample preparation procedures and assessing your extraction recovery. Keep in mind that many states will require analysis and reporting of up to 9 to 12 different cannabinoids, and that cannabinoid-specific recoveries can vary. It's important, therefore, to have really good quality control and internal standard use, and to engage in calibration curves over multiple log points. The easiest way to calibrate is using a 3-point calibration curve, obviously, but this doesn't cover much of a dynamic range. A 7-point curve is much preferable, given that you want to be able to analyze products of varying purity, and you don't want to have to constantly recalibrate. This ensures accuracy on the high and low end of your cannabinoid titration. So this brings us to the topic of the need for industry standardization. In this industry, we don't have much in the way of method standardization for reasons previously noted. Laboratories in the same market are typically in competition and don't want to share their methods with one another. But what we need more than anything else is a uniform approach to standardizing our methods, which has to be dictated by the state regulatory agency. The result of this, if implemented well and early, is that it reduces lab-to-lab variation. Another tool that can be used to achieve this same endpoint is proficiency testing, including approaches often used in the clinical toxicology arena, such as round-robin testing. This serves to improve industry credibility, protect the consumer, and facilitate transparency in the industry, which is really critical. So you might ask, why is this critical? Well, labs may be independent, but cultivators pick their laboratories. In no other industry do clients look at or scrutinize the results like in cannabis testing. It's no secret that every client wants the highest cannabinoid titration possible. 19.5% cannabinoid content versus 20% is almost the same number analytically. But to the client, this may seem like a huge difference. In Nevada, for instance, under medical dispensaries would not purchase flower under the 20% threshold. This results in tremendous pressure on laboratories to inflate their values. Examples of this in other markets have been seen in the media lately, including an investigation in the Bay Area of California by NBC, looking at test results shopped around to different laboratories and finding significant variations based on who was proposing the tests. Also in Washington, there was a recent report of a laboratory scandal where a top cannabis laboratory was hit with a suspension for misrepresenting their results. So these are some of the cautionary tales in laboratory testing, unfortunately, that we have to deal with. So while a lot of the items discussed might seem minor to the cost of compliance, in the cannabis sector, these can add up quickly. And I want to make sure that everybody realizes that and takes that into account. It's really important to understand not just your customer base, but the customer base of your client, the cultivator or producer. If they can't sell what they produce, they won't test it. Be prepared for customers to shop labs to find the best results. Work closely with your state and other labs to address and prevent this early on. With a limited customer base to pull from, competition and pricing amongst labs can be fierce. Be prepared for this competition. If you are successful, where are you going to put your money? So you have to be prepared to be paid in cash. Labs will lose a bank account just as quickly as any other marijuana entity. Handling and tracking cash also adds expense to your operations and is something you need to keep in mind. So this concludes my talk today, and I hope that our discussion has helped you understand the dynamics of setting up and running a cannabis lab in a bit more detail. Thank you very much.